The great thing about summer ending, for me and probably a lot of you out there, is that football season is right around the corner. College football, sure, but especially the NFL. I mean, that's what this country really lives for more than any other sport. Maybe the rest of the world doesn't get why we love football so much, just like maybe we don't understand why the rest of the world loves soccer so much. But yet and still, we love football. And along with football comes something that for a lot of fans enhances the viewing experience, and that is fantasy football. I used to think as a little kid that fantasy football was honestly pretty dumb. I didn't understand it, even though I loved stats and loved watching all the games. I was like, I don't see what the point of this is. But as I started to do it, over a decade ago and really got into it, I quickly learned that it makes you pay attention to and care about games you would have no business giving two hoots about otherwise. For example, as a Bears fan, if I see like the Kansas City Chiefs and the Seattle Seahawks, normally I wouldn't give two flips about that game unless maybe the Seahawks could potentially knock the Bears out of a playoff spot or something. But like a Week 3 game, I wouldn't care about a game between those two teams. But I would care if I had Dwayne Bowe as one of my starting wide receivers. It's amazing how much more emotionally invested in football in general throughout the entire NFL you become as a fan when you have somebody on your fantasy football team, or sometimes you're going against somebody else's fantasy football team. And over the years, as I've done fantasy football, had a fair amount of success, you learn some things to do and learn some things to not do. And that definitely holds true to me. There are certain philosophies every year come fantasy football draft time that I try to stick to. Some things to make sure that I do and some things to avoid. So I'm going to share some of that with you now because we're entering into fantasy football draft season. And for some of you that maybe want some help or some advice, I'll do what I can to give you the best advice I can possibly give. So let's start off with some of the do's of fantasy football drafting. When you accept that invite from somebody online, Yahoo, CBS Sports Line, ESPN, whatever type of league you're in, the first and most important thing you do after you register for the league, especially when you're not the commissioner, is to go to the league's scoring and settings and to see how the scoring breakdown works. I cannot tell you how many times over the past 10 plus years I've been doing fantasy football and I'll be in a draft and you could clearly tell that somebody didn't bother to take the time to look to see how the league's being scored. They'll take like 3 running backs and a quarterback, let's say in the first 4 rounds, and it's a league that gives you a point per reception. And 2 of the running backs that they drafted aren't really pass catchers out of the backfield. So all the while, somebody else in that league will have drafted 2 running backs that catch the ball out of the backfield but maybe don't run as much, a wide receiver or 2, and that's their first 4 rounds. And it's no surprise that this team here will be knocking on the door of a fantasy championship in that league, and this team here will be on the outside looking in. So I emphasize and implore to you, any fantasy league you get in, whether it's 1, 4, 20, I don't care however many, everyone that you join, make sure you go check out how the league is scoring everything and adjust your draft strategy accordingly. Do pay attention to the week like 13 or 14 through 16 schedules. Most fantasy leagues have a playoff of some kind, whether it's 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and it tends to fall somewhere in that week 13 through 16 range. What you don't want to have happen is a guy that puts up a shit ton of points for you and you're kicking ass through the first 12 weeks, and then you enter the fantasy playoffs, and maybe this guy is either sitting down because his team has already clinched a playoff spot, or he's facing some bad matchups against some tough defenses. A lot of you guys maybe in previous years that have had Peyton Manning as your fantasy quarterback know what I'm talking about. Through 13 weeks, he's putting up all types of phenomenal numbers for you. But when you get to the fantasy playoffs and he's sitting his ass on the bench, he's no good to you. Or maybe you had a quarterback that was kicking ass against a soft schedule during the course of the year, and then come playoff time, his schedule toughened up, faced some tough passing defenses or rushing defenses, and their numbers sagged, and you ended up getting booted when maybe you shouldn't have. And on the flip side, you could have somebody that kind of toes the line most of the year, but their schedule's soft at the end of the year. And that's where you always see every year some guys that have tremendous performances towards the end of the season that people will talk about for years being the reason that they advanced in the playoffs or won their fantasy championship. So do yourself a favor. when you're getting ready to put your draft boards together and you're thinking about drafting guys, do keep an eye on that schedule at the end of the year because it does make a difference. Do draft with an eye towards later trades. If you've been able to amass a good wide receiving core that's maybe 5 or 6 deep of guys that could score 12 to 15 points a week, but your running backs are boo-boo, well, maybe somebody else has 5 to 6 running backs that score 15 to 20 points per week, but their wide receivers are boo-boo. And once you get to a certain point in time of the year, when you get past the bye weeks and the realization starts to set in that this guy needs points from wide receiver if they're going to have a chance to win it all, and you need points from a running back in any chance that you can actually win it all, you might be able to make some trades. The point being is if you find that you have a weakness at one position, or you think you didn't draft well at that position, don't panic. Maybe beef yourself up at other spots so that way when the time comes, you may have the ammunition you need to go get that 1 or 2 pieces that you need to help deliver you a fantasy championship. I see it happen every year, and it never ceases to amaze me. Do pay attention to the bye weeks. Seriously. They put it there in the draft rooms for you to see what week this guy has a bye, etc., blah, blah, blah. Where I really see the mistake made is not so much maybe if you draft 2 stud running backs and they both happen to have the same bye week, but let's say somebody drafts a tight end and then later on in the draft drafts a backup who's clearly a step below, and they draft one with the same bye week. Why would you draft all your bench players to have the same bye week as your starters? That's kind of puzzling. Now, you could sit there and go with the philosophy of you want to try and spread your bye weeks out as much as possible so that way you don't have too many people out of the lineup on a given week, and that's definitely a way to go. A couple of times I've done it in the past, and it's been relatively successful. I've said, screw that. I'm going to try and draft as many people with the same bye week as possible, so that way maybe I end up tanking 1 week, but after that, I'm free and clear and going against a bunch of other people that have 3 or 4 players on a bye in a given week. The fact of the matter is, bye weeks are important, so it's important to pay attention to them, but there are a couple of different strategies you could use. Just don't sit there and draft a bunch of starters that all have different bye weeks, but all their backups have the same bye weeks as the starters in that spot. That's kind of silly. As you're going through and trying to fill out your roster, do be mindful to draft running backs that could potentially start later in the year, whether this be rookies that maybe were drafted in the 3rd, 4th, 5th round, or backups on a team with a somewhat questionable starter. A lot of times, it's not the running backs that you draft to start the year for you. It's the running backs that you draft to finish the year for you that end up coming strong with fresh legs in weeks 13 through 16 that end up winning you that fantasy football league title. So make sure to draft running backs that sit on your bench maybe for several weeks. Hold on to them with an eye for maybe they'll eventually replace a starter or their guy ahead of them will get injured, and you end up being able to plug them in and you get a real bang for your buck based off of where you drafted them. The last major do for me for fantasy football drafting is maybe more of a personal thing and down to a personal preference, but I've found a lot of success over the past 4 or 5 years drafting 2 and sometimes 3 wide receivers very, very early. I've always felt after the first couple of running backs that the rest of the field kind of levels out, and some guys you draft too high don't perform, and other guys you draft very low perform expectations. But wide receiver seems to be a position to me that if you can get those 2 or 3 big names that you can consistently count on to produce double-digit plus points every single week, the teams that tend to have those wide receivers tend to be the ones you see stick around late into the fantasy playoffs. Over the past couple of years in particular, I think this strategy started to make a lot more sense as more teams became pass-first offenses and more quarterbacks started putting up 3,500, 4,000 passing yard seasons or more. There's just not that much importance, in my opinion, on drafting a quarterback very high. Sure, it's great if you can get an Aaron Rodgers on your team. It's great if you have a Tom Brady or a Drew Brees. But I know myself, I've proven that you can be very successful in the fantasy football realm without having one of those huge name quarterbacks. You think about it, if you're in a 10 or 12 team league and everybody else drafts a quarterback high, but you don't, at some point in time, you're going to have to draft one anyways, but you'll still be able to get your choice out of a whole lot of guys that still will put up very decent numbers for you. But what you've been doing while these other teams have been drafting for quarterbacks, you've been filling in depth at running back and wide receiver and what have you, and you end up with a more stacked, balanced, all-around team than what they have, and still potentially have a big-time point producer at the quarterback position. Don't reach for a tight end. Seriously. There's only a couple of elite ones, I know. I understand that the temptation is there if a Gronkowski's on the board in the 3rd round, or a Jimmy Graham's on the board, what have you, or an Antonio Gates is there on the board in the 4th round. You look and you're like, there's not a lot of great point producers at that position. And yes, that's true. But if you take a tight end, let's say, too high, and maybe he only scores 150 or 160 points, you may have passed up potentially on a wide receiver or a running back that could have scored you 200, 225, 250 points. You know, in the overall scheme of things, maybe you take a bit of a hit by getting a second-tier tight end, but after those top few tight ends, everybody else is kind of a random, spin of the wheel anyways. But you could be bypassing better players that will score more points at a more important position. I gotta be honest, out of all my pet peeves from what I see in fantasy football drafts year after year after year, every time I see it, I want to jump through the screen and kick somebody in the freaking gonads. Don't ever draft a kicker before the last round. Why? What's the difference between the number 1 ranked kicker and the number 20 ranked kicker? It's not that much. So why would you draft one before you absolutely had to? I don't get it. I see people that draft them in like the 8th or 9th round, and then they wonder why their team sucks. It's because you took a kicker before the last round. And if any of you ever have, don't repeat that mistake this year, please. Most leagues only require you to have one starting quarterback. You don't have to have a quarterback on the bench. So don't draft one. If you've gotten an Aaron Rodgers or a Drew Brees or a Phillip Rivers or a Tom Brady or a Cam Newton, a Michael Vick, somebody like that. Once you draft one of them, focus on other positions throughout the rest of your draft. Running back, tight end, wide receiver, team defense, whatever the case might be. I can't believe how many times I see a draft where somebody drafts a quarterback in the 3rd round, then in the 8th round they're drafting another quarterback. What happens is one of two things. Either A, those two quarterbacks are too similar in performance, and you end up having to manage your roster too much every week. You put this guy in when this guy ends up scoring more, and you cost yourself points. Number 2, you're wasting a precious roster spot if you sit there and draft one in the 3rd round, draft one like in the 15th or 20th round, when that guy might only be in your lineup during this other guy's bye week. Just like I said, don't ever draft a backup quarterback, especially if the league's roster settings don't require you to. The same thing goes for a team defense. You'll see a lot of fantasy owners, at least a couple of them in every league you're in, will be like, "Ooh, I've got this guy, so I've got to draft a backup." No, this isn't like the real world. This is fantasy football. You don't have to dedicate a second roster spot to a team defense that will hardly ever be in your starting lineup. Or if they're that much like your first team defense, you're going to overmanage things and put the wrong defense in most weeks and cost yourself a lot of points. Dedicate that extra roster spot instead of getting a backup there when you would only really need that backup for 1 week if you've got a good team defense, to another running back or a wide receiver, making yourself a potentially more attractive trade partner for somebody else that needs help, just like you would towards the fantasy trading deadline. Don't just draft where your loyalties lie. Maybe I'm telling this to Bear fans in particular, but every year, guaranteed, I'll be in a draft with at least one other fellow Bear fan, and they will draft all of the Bears' offensive players. And then they will wonder, come week 13, why they're in butt-naked last in the league. Your favorite team is somebody that has a prolific offense. Maybe you want a couple of guys from there. But don't sit there and base your entire success as a fantasy team off of just one roster. Don't just draft everybody from the Green Bay Packers, or don't just draft everybody from the New Orleans Saints. Because what happens maybe week 15 or 16, you've been kicking ass all year, and then that team goes out there and lays a freaking egg on offense. Stay away from drafting with your heart. Don't do it. Don't do it. Use your head instead. Thanks for those of you that watched the entire video. I'll be doing more fantasy football related videos throughout all of the football season, believe me, and there will be a lot more NFL related videos in the months to come on this channel. So thanks for watching.